Six 155mm rockets shriek off the deck of a British landing craft and slam grapnel hooks into wet French clay 100 feet above the heads of 225 American Rangers. It is 07:10 on June 6, 1944, and the men crouching below Pointe du Hoc are looking up at a cliff that should not be climbable, at a battery of guns that should not be silenced, and at a mission that almost everyone above their pay grade privately believes will fail. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder stands among them. He did not have to be here. His superiors wanted him back at headquarters, directing the operation from the safety of a command post. Rudder refused. If his men were climbing this cliff under German fire, he was climbing it with them. The plan itself sounds almost absurd when spoken aloud. Ropes tipped with grappling irons, fired from rocket launchers bolted to the decks of converted landing craft, are meant to snag the crumbling earth at the clifftop and hold fast long enough for exhausted seasick men in soaked wool uniforms to haul themselves, hand over hand, up a near-vertical rock face while German soldiers drop grenades on them from above. Some of the ropes are wet through and too heavy for the rockets to carry the full distance. Some ladders, borrowed specially from the London Fire Brigade and mounted on DUKW amphibious trucks, will prove too short, too unstable, or simply unusable on the shattered, cratered ground at the base of the cliff. This is not a metaphorical cliff edge. It is the actual edge of the invasion, the hinge on which the entire Omaha and Utah beach landings are meant to turn, and there is no guarantee any of it will work. Why does any of this matter enough to risk 200 men on ropes and ladders against a sheer rock face? Because sitting atop Pointe du Hoc, according to Allied intelligence, is a battery of 6 French-built 155mm guns with a range of more than 20 kilometers, guns capable of reaching both invasion beaches simultaneously and turning the most carefully planned amphibious assault in history into a slaughter on the sand. Silencing them is not one objective among many on D-Day. It is, in the judgment of the planners who built Operation Overlord from the ground up, one of the handful of tasks that must succeed, or the entire invasion could unravel before it properly begins. The problem facing Allied planners in the months before June 1944 was not simply that the Germans had built strong coastal defenses. It was that they had built them precisely where the Allies most needed to land. Pointe du Hoc sits on a promontory between the beaches later codenamed Utah and Omaha, a spur of rock jutting into the channel with clear sight lines across miles of open water. Aerial reconnaissance through 1943 and early 1944 had confirmed what planners feared. The Germans were constructing reinforced concrete casemates there, designed to house heavy coastal artillery capable of raining shells onto landing craft long before they reached the sand. Naval gunfire alone could not be relied upon to eliminate the position. The casemates were built with roofs and walls of concrete more than 2 meters thick in places, engineered specifically to withstand sustained bombardment from ships offshore. Bombing runs by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had pounded the site repeatedly in the weeks before the invasion, cratering the ground until it resembled the surface of the moon. Yet photographic evidence suggested the guns themselves, or at least their positions, remained intact and potentially operational. This created an impossible tactical puzzle. Naval guns could not guarantee a kill from several kilometers offshore, not against reinforced casemates angled to deflect shell fire. Aerial bombardment could crater the approaches and rattle the defenders, but a battery buried in concrete does not necessarily die from having earth thrown at it. The only way to be certain the guns at Pointe du Hoc could never fire on the beaches was to physically reach them, confirm their condition, and destroy them by hand if necessary. And the only approach to the position that offered any element of surprise was the one the Germans considered essentially impossible to use. Straight up the sea-facing cliff, rising some 25 to 30 meters above a narrow, rocky shingle beach, an approach so implausible that German defenses, while formidable, were concentrated more heavily against a landward assault than against men coming up from the water below. Assigning this task to conventional infantry made little sense. What the mission demanded was a unit trained specifically for assault climbing under fire, comfortable with technical rope work, drilled in demolition, and psychologically prepared for operation with an unusually high chance of failure. That unit was the 2nd Ranger Battalion, United States Army, formed and trained for exactly this category of mission and placed under the command of Rudder, a Texas A&M football coach turned soldier whose reputation for demanding, realistic training had already marked him as the right man to lead an assault few others wanted. There was also a wider strategic anxiety feeding into the decision to commit an entire battalion to this single objective. Planners drawing up Operation Overlord had spent more than a year working through the likely consequences of a failed or badly bloodied landing on the Normandy beaches, and they understood that public and political tolerance for a repeat of a disaster on the scale of the 1942 Dieppe raid was essentially non-existent. Dieppe had shown, at brutal cost, what happened when landing troops met coastal defenses that remained largely intact and unsuppressed. Pointe du Hoc, sitting almost exactly between the two American beaches, represented precisely the kind of unresolved threat that could turn Utah or Omaha into another Dieppe. This is part of why the mission was given to a purpose-built unit rather than folded into the ordinary infantry assault plan. The margin for error was judged too thin to risk on troops without the specific training the task demanded. The solution the planners settled on combined 3 technologies that individually were unremarkable, but together produced something close to a purpose-built assault system. The first was the rocket-propelled grapnel, a modified naval rocket fitted with a folding grappling hook and trailing a coil of rope, fired from racks mounted on the front of British crewed landing craft. Each rocket carried enough propellant to send a rope roughly the height of a 10-story building in under 2 seconds, embedding the hook into soft ground at the clifftop, where, in theory, it would hold firm under a climbing man's weight. In practice, seawater soaked many of the ropes during the run-in to the beach, adding enough weight that several rockets fell short of the top, landing the hooks partway up the cliff face rather than over the edge. The second element was toggle rope and free climbing technique, the fallback the Rangers had drilled relentlessly during training on the cliffs of the English south coast. Where the rocket ropes failed to reach, men climbed anyway, using bayonets and combat knives driven into the clay as improvised handholds, hauling themselves up loose earth that gave way beneath their boots, all while German defenders above rolled grenades over the edge and, in places, used knives to cut the ropes that had successfully caught. The third element, and in some ways the most unglamorous, was the extending ladder system borrowed from the London Fire Brigade and mounted on DUKW amphibious trucks driven directly onto the narrow beach. The idea was for these motorized ladders to extend upward like a fire engine reaching a burning building, giving Rangers a stable route to the top. Cratered ground from the pre-invasion bombing meant the DUKWs could not maneuver close enough to the cliff for the ladders to be practical, and the concept, sound on paper, largely failed in the chaos of the actual landing. What made the difference in the end was neither the rockets nor the ladders, but the sheer physical persistence of men climbing a near-vertical clay cliff by hand, under fire, in soaked uniforms, carrying rifles, ammunition, and demolition charges, while comrades beside them were shot from the ropes or fell when handholds crumbled. Within roughly 5 minutes of reaching the base of the cliff, the first Rangers had scrambled over the top, a pace that surprised even the planners who had rehearsed the assault repeatedly on similar terrain in England. It is worth pausing on the scale of that achievement. 225 men climbing what amounts to a 9-story rock face under direct enemy fire, in under 10 minutes for the leading elements, is not a statistic that survives easily in the retelling. It sounds too clean, too fast, almost cinematic. Yet, the after-action reports and the survivors' own accounts, however chaotic and contradictory in the details, converge on that essential fact. None of this speed was accidental. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had spent months training on cliffs along the English coast near the Isle of Wight, deliberately chosen for their resemblance in height and composition to the chalk and clay formations at Pointe du Hoc. Rudder insisted on repeated, realistic rehearsal, often at night, often in poor weather, on the reasoning that a technique which only worked in fair conditions on a dry practice cliff was of no use on an actual invasion beach. Men trained with the same rope and grapnel equipment they would use in Normandy, learned to read where the clay would hold a boot and where it would simply crumble away, and drilled the sequence of climbing, securing, and covering fire for following men until it required no conscious thought under pressure. That preparation is easy to overlook in a story built around a single dramatic morning, yet it is arguably as important to the outcome as anything that happened on the day itself. A unit given ropes and rockets without that grounding and repetition would very likely have suffered even heavier losses for a slower, less certain result. Once at the top, the Rangers who reached the casemates found something none of the planning had quite prepared them for. The guns were not there. The concrete emplacements, cratered and battered by weeks of bombing, stood empty, their supposed 155mm guns nowhere to be seen. For a unit that had just paid a heavy price to reach this position, the discovery could easily have produced confusion, even despair. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is more to come. What happened next has become one of the more quietly remarkable footnotes of the entire Normandy campaign. A small patrol, led by Sergeant Leonard Lamel together with Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, pushed inland from the cliff position to investigate a sunken country lane, and there, in an orchard roughly a kilometer from the coast, found the missing guns. They had been withdrawn from the casemates in the days before the invasion, camouflaged under netting and hedgerows, apparently to protect them from the ongoing air bombardment, and left with what appears to have been minimal guard. Lomel and Kuhn, working essentially alone and without waiting for reinforcement, used thermite grenades to disable the traversing and elevating mechanisms of the guns, rendering them useless before a larger demolition party arrived to finish the job with further charges. The battery that had haunted Allied planning for months, the guns capable of reaching both invasion beaches, were put out of action not by naval bombardment, not by aerial bombing, but by 2 American sergeants working with grenades in a French apple orchard. Records of the wider fighting that followed remain, in places, genuinely difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Communication with the fleet offshore broke down for hours after the initial landing, leaving Rudder's force isolated on the clifftop without reliable contact for confirmation of their success or requests for reinforcement. What is well documented is that the Rangers, having taken the position, then had to hold it. German counterattacks came repeatedly over the following 2 days, targeting a force that had already suffered heavy casualties simply reaching the top of the cliff. Reinforcement that was meant to arrive from Omaha Beach within hours was delayed by the ferocious fighting on that beach itself, leaving the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc to defend an isolated, exposed position with dwindling ammunition and no realistic prospect of rapid relief. By the time relief did arrive, roughly 2 days after the initial assault, the battalion that had landed 225 strong had been reduced to something in the region of 90 men still able to fight, a casualty rate that speaks for itself without need of embellishment. The psychological toll on the German defenders is harder to quantify with precision, and honest accounts acknowledge that much of what can be said here rests on fragmentary German records and post-war interviews rather than a full contemporaneous account from the defending side. What does seem clear is that an assault route considered by German planners to be effectively unusable had been used successfully by an enemy force willing to accept extraordinary casualties to achieve a narrow but critical objective. The German coastal defenses at Pointe du Hoc were, in their own right, a formidable piece of military engineering, and it is worth setting the Ranger assault against what else was attempted and considered elsewhere along the invasion front. Nowhere else on June 6th did Allied planners commit an entire specialist battalion to a direct cliff assault of this scale. Commando raids elsewhere in the war, including earlier British operations against coastal batteries, had typically relied on stealth and small numbers rather than a full battalion committed to a technical climb under active fire in broad daylight. The scale of the Pointe du Hoc assault and its position within a wider synchronized invasion timetable made it something closer to unique among Allied special operations of the war. German alternatives to defending against this kind of assault were limited by simple geography. Coastal artillery positions throughout the Atlantic Wall were generally sited with landward and seaward approaches in mind, but a sheer cliff assault from small craft directly below the position was not a scenario most defensive planning anticipated as a serious threat precisely because it appeared, on paper, close to impossible. That assumption, reasonable as it may have seemed to German engineers surveying the terrain, proved to be the single greatest vulnerability in an otherwise well-conceived defensive position. American planners had in effect identified and exploited a gap not in the concrete but in the imagination of the men who had designed the defenses. It is also worth comparing the Pointe du Hoc plan with how other Allied forces approached hardened coastal positions elsewhere on the invasion front that same morning. On Omaha and Utah beaches, the general approach to strongpoints was direct frontal assault supported by naval gunfire and armor, a method that, on Omaha in particular, produced catastrophic casualties against defenses that had survived the preliminary bombardment largely intact. The Pointe du Hoc plan deliberately avoided this pattern, trading a frontal approach for one that exploited terrain the defenders considered unusable, at the cost of requiring a far higher level of specialist skill from the assaulting troops. Later in the war, similar reasoning would inform smaller-scale special operations raids by British commando units against isolated coastal positions, though rarely on the scale of a full battalion committed to a synchronized, timetabled assault within a larger invasion. In that sense, Pointe du Hoc sits at an unusual intersection between conventional battlefield tactics and the kind of small unit, high-skill special operations more commonly associated with commando raiding parties earlier in the war. Assessing the actual historical impact of the Pointe du Hoc assault requires a degree of honesty that popular retellings do not always offer. The guns that so worried Allied planners were, by the morning of the invasion, already relocated and arguably less immediately threatening to the landing beaches than intelligence had assessed. This does not diminish what the Rangers achieved. It was precisely because the guns had been moved, rather than destroyed in their casemates by bombing, that finding and disabling them required men on the ground, and it was precisely the uncertainty over their exact location and condition that made the mission necessary in the first place. Planners could not simply assume the guns were gone. Confirming their fate and eliminating the threat with certainty demanded exactly the kind of direct physical reconnaissance and destruction that Lommel and Kuhn's patrol carried out. The material effect in the narrowest sense was 6 guns permanently disabled. The wider effect was the removal of genuine uncertainty from an invasion plan that could not afford unresolved threats to its flanks. The site today remains largely as the fighting left it, a landscape of grass-covered shell craters and the ruined concrete of German casemates, preserved by the American Battle Monuments Commission as a memorial to the men who fought there. Visitors can still walk the ground the Rangers climbed, still see the twisted remains of observation posts, still stand at the cliff edge and look down at the narrow strip of shingle beach where the assault began. Few sights from the Normandy campaign convey the physical reality of what was demanded of the men who fought there quite so directly. Return for a moment to that morning, to the rockets shrieking off the landing craft decks and the ropes snapping taut against wet clay. 225 men climbed a cliff that intelligence reports, terrain analysis, and simple common sense suggested should not be climbable, under fire, in under 10 minutes, to reach guns that were not where anyone expected them to be. They found those guns anyway, in an orchard a kilometer inland, and destroyed them with grenades because grenades were what they had. They held an isolated clifftop position for 2 days against repeated counterattacks with a force reduced by more than half, waiting for relief that arrived late through no fault of their own. None of this required the kind of dramatic embellishment that popular history sometimes adds to stories that do not need it. What happened at Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, was, in the plainest possible terms, A small number of trained men doing something genuinely difficult, under conditions that offered no guarantee of survival, because the alternative was to leave a threat unresolved on the flank of the largest amphibious invasion in history. The cliff is still there, the craters are still there, and the men who climbed it in the end did exactly what they were asked to do.